Welcome. Today is the 17th day of Tammuz, the first of the two fast days, and the first day beginning the period called the 3 weeks, during which we mourn the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and we will include that in today's presentation. It's also the 23rd day of July. The 17th day of Tammuz is the first calamity. There are 5 calamities usually discussed that happened on this day. The first one was the shattering of the first tablets of the covenant that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, because this was the day, the 40th day after he had ascended. He came back down with the tablets that God had given him, inscribed with the Decalogue. And when he saw the golden calf that the Israelites had made and then worshipped, he shattered them. On the 17th of Tammuz, in the Second Temple period, the wall of the city was breached, and 3 weeks later the wall of the temple was breached, and then it was destroyed on the 9th of Av. So this is a very difficult period in Jewish history. It's called the low point of the Jewish calendar. But in the recent decades, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very insistent that this low point is not to be interpreted as a time of feeling low. It should actually be a time of striving for more, of adding more. And the famous saying in the Talmud, "Mishenichnas Av mematin b'simcha," that when Av, the month of Av, which will start in 13 days, comes in or begins, we should, the usual interpretation is lessen our joy. He explained it to mean that we should lessen those things that are negative in our lives with joy, and not to feel that when we're cutting out the things that don't fit, that we shouldn't have, that we shouldn't be doing, that we have a feeling of being in mourning over them, of having lost them. Rather the contrary. We should feel the joy of coming closer to God. And this is something that's very necessary in wealthy Western countries, where people eat too much, they buy too much, they don't enjoy less. And every person knows in what areas of life they need to take this as a guide to try to find more joy in life. Because actually, when you do remove the things that are superfluous, that are not needed, they come from our evil inclination, our need to satisfy ourselves, to give ourselves a pat on the back, and so on, there is more joy in life. So that's a general idea. And that the creation, the building of the new temple is dependent on this shift in our consciousness. We're also in the third reading of Parshat Pinchas, and the end of the third reading is the most feminist, one would say, reading of the entire Torah, of the entire Pentateuch. And we hear about the 5 daughters of a man named Tzlofchad, who, having learned the laws of inheritance and having studied them carefully, came to Moses and demanded that their special case be heard. Their special case was that their father did not have any boys. There were only 5 girls. And according to the current laws of inheritance, there's no way that they will inherit any land in the land of Israel. And they wanted their case to be heard, and for Moses to give a verdict about what their legal status would be, whether they could inherit land or not. I don't want to get into that except to mention that the moment that you have a feminist reading, meaning one that centers on the role of the feminine in the world, it's a sign of change. It's a sign of, one might say, a consciousness shift. A paradigm shift in consciousness. There's another paradigm shift which is sort of hinted to inside their words, they mention that their father, they don't mention how he died, but they say, our father was one of the people who died in the desert, but he was not in the assembly that banded together against God in Korach's assembly, that we read about a couple of weeks ago. Rather, he died only for his own sin. Now, this is a shift in consciousness as well. It's sort of implicit here. But what they're saying is something that the prophets say later on, the later prophets, that in the time of the redemption, the time when the third temple will be built, there will no longer be a reckoning among generations. In other words, every person will die in his own sin. Every person will be tried and judged only for themselves, not for the sins of their fathers, grandfathers, and so on, even though this principle appears in the Decalogue. It appears in what's called the Ten Commandments, that there are sins that move on from generation to generation, and then you have this state in which people are judged for events and actions that were taken by their predecessors. The reason for this is that, as the commentaries explain, the reason that we are judged for events from the past is because we hold on to them. We're not able to really break free from the customs, maybe from the hatred in the case of Islam, maybe from the culture in the case of cultures that are destructive, violent, aggressive, and so on. And people hold on to these cultures, they hold on to these feelings, they hold on to these norms. And then in that case, God continues the judgment upon the further generations. But when a person is really bent on doing true return to God, true tshuva, repentance, and forsakes the ways of his predecessors, then we each stand individually before God. And this has to do also with religions, and certain religions, and looking at what they've done in the past, looking at what they've believed in, looking at how they've acted. If a person is of true heart and mind to find the truth and to stand before God naked, ready to hear God's word, then the past is no longer relevant. And he turns a new leaf, he starts a new reckoning individually before God. So these two signs of both a feminist paradigm shift and this idea that every person stands individually before God are very powerful at the end of today's reading. We want to connect this to the destruction of the temple and why it's been 2,000 years. We can't know for sure. But the way that it's explained in the Zohar, in the Talmud even to some extent, but certainly in the Zohar, is that when the first temple was destroyed, they had a date when it would be rebuilt. The prophet Jeremiah told them it would take 70 years. And so they waited for 70 years. By the way, the Exodus from Egypt also had a date, because really God had said they would be in a foreign land for 400 years. The question was when to start the counting. But they had this idea that there's a limited amount of time that we have to be in exile. The same thing was much truer of the first exile, the Babylonian exile, which Jeremiah said was limited to 70 years. And then the question that really needs to be asked is, why didn't everybody move back to the land of Israel after 70 years were over? The answers are varied and complex. We don't have time to go over them now. But the sages in the Talmud, and to more so an extent in the Zohar, say, but the current exile has been going on for, at their time, hundreds of years already. In our time, 2,000 years almost. Why is there no limit to it? Why did we not have a prophecy, some kind of indication of when the end would be? And the answer that they give is because it's a different type of exile. It's not a punishment for sins. In other words, the people of the generation of the destruction were punished. That punishment is not continuing to be delved out to the Jewish people. It's not continual punishment for that, for whatever the actions were in the Second Temple. It's something completely different. It's about exactly what we just talked about, a paradigm shift. In other words, the Third Temple is going to be nothing like the Second Temple. It doesn't mean that there won't be sacrifices, but it means that the meaning of serving God will be so completely different that it takes maybe millennia to reach that maturity of thought, to be able to serve God in that way, and to actually benefit from a third temple that will be essentially different than the first two. And to illustrate this in the positive way, there's a famous parable brought in the Hasidic tradition, discussed in length by Reb Hillel of Parich. On my YouTube channel, there's a playlist called Why Redemption is Not a Punishment. I think it's about 30 or 40 short classes of 20 minutes. You can also watch another rendition of this article from Reb Hillel of Parich from Y.Y. Jacobson, if you know where to find his channel. I recommend either. We both discuss what this very deep article means, and I'm going to recap it in a couple of minutes now. And the essential parable that Reb Hillel brings is that there's a teacher teaching his best students, and in the middle of the lecture, he suddenly becomes silent, and after a few minutes of not saying anything, walks out of the room. And he disappears for a while. A few days later, the students think he's angry at them because they must have done something to upset him. They have no idea what's going on. A few days later, he shows up again and explains, "My dear students, I had no anger at you. There's nothing wrong with what you did. But while I was teaching this very complex issue we were dealing with," and this especially would be true in dealing with a complex issue in the Talmud, "it came to me that the way I had been explaining it until now was inferior to a much superior way of seeing things. And when it hit me," and this usually does happen when you teach, you suddenly get insights into what you're teaching. When I realized this far superior understanding of the text, I couldn't continue the lecture. I had to step away, I had to regather my thoughts, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I was not prepared yet, and you are not prepared yet, to hear this far superior explanation and much deeper understanding of the topic at hand. And so I had to take a break for a few days and stay at home and rethink everything, build a new lesson plan, and here I am back again to teach you a completely different way of looking at this. That, in a nutshell, is Reb Hillel of Parich's parable. And he says, the destruction of the Second Temple, yes, it had an element of a punishment, but more than anything, after it was destroyed, the fact that it wasn't rebuilt immediately is a sign that where we're going is completely different. It's not going to be a restitution of the previous two temples. It's not going to be going back to where we were. It's going to be a complete revolution in human consciousness, in the understanding of what it means to have a relationship with God, why you need a temple in the first place. What does it mean that the Jewish people are a chosen people? What does it mean that God gave a Torah? What does it mean that there was prophecy in the world? What does it mean that now there might be new prophecy, which is of a different nature altogether? All of these things represent a paradigm shift that's never happened in the history of the world, or the closest to it was when the Torah was given. But Moses, as we said, he shattered the first set of tablets. Also, that too can be understood, not as a punishment, but as a sign that the previous way of looking at the covenant with God has to be rethought, it has to be redone. And so the second set of tablets is considered to be like a paradigm shift, where the first set of tablets was given by God made by God, made in heaven, brought down by Moses. The second set of tablets was made by Moses and inscribed upon by God, which is far more similar to the type of revelations that we're familiar with, a revelation in which man works very hard to achieve a certain spiritual level, and then he is inspired by godliness, and then he is inspired to say things. The same thing, the same type of paradigm shift is occurring now. The third temple will be nothing like the first two. It won't mean the same thing. It'll be a completely new covenant in the sense that the heavens and the earth will even be experienced differently by us. This means that human consciousness is at a turning point, or an inflection point. And that inflection point is what we're preparing for now. In a certain sense, when we lessen, as these 3 weeks of relative mourning come in, we lessen our dependence on the way that we usually think, and we open ourselves to joy, to a completely different type of covenant with God, a completely different way of being with God, a completely different way of serving God, and maybe most importantly, more than everything else, a completely different way of understanding human life, its meaning, its value, and how to live with one another. Thank you very much for joining today. If you're fasting, I wish you an easy fast. It shouldn't be hard. It should be easy. It should be one. And people say it should be meaningful. It should be meaningful in opening this new paradigm of thought for all of us, even for those who are not fasting, even those who are not aware that that is really the Jewish program. It's leading this paradigm shift in human consciousness. All the best.